Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Davis, and today we're going to talk about adolescent development. So let's just go ahead and start by defining what adolescence is. And adolescence is the transition from childhood into adulthood, and it really ranges quite a long period of time from the onset of puberty, which is about 11 or so, 12 or so, and then it goes on to full independence when you're on your own. And really, a lot of what kind of determines puberty or adolescence rather is the physical beginnings of sexual maturity. So we're talking about physical changes and that you might notice. And what's interesting to note is that this window has actually grown. This adolescence period, we consider it now. Back in the 1890s, women would puberty would start when the women would start their period. They actually were starting their period later on, so about 15 years old. And then once they had their period, they would be in adolescence essentially until they got married, which was around 22. Whereas now, what girls are starting to get their period about 12 and a half, and they are not getting married until about 25. So suddenly, this span of adolescence has actually grown based on everybody getting an formal education, financial independence, and adulthood really kind of being defined as after once you start kind of being independent on your own financially. So puberty specifically is when we have the sexual maturation and when we start we're able to reproduce, and we start having these really significant physical changes. We're going to have mood changes. We're going to have body changes. We're going to have hormone changes. Women, we start periods about age 11-ish now, 11, 12-ish now. And boys, puberty usually starts around 13 years old. So it's a little bit later than girls, but it's still in the middle school years. So, what are the primary sex characteristics? The development of it actually happens during puberty. Girls get their first menstrual cycle. It's called menarche. And boys actually start having their first ejaculatory experience, so they're able to. It's called spermarchy. And what happens is you'll notice in this right here, um, we have the girls and boys stay pretty much consistent around the same until about 11 or so. And at that point, girls hit puberty. They suddenly have a growth spurt, end up taller than boys for a little while. And then in about 12, I don't know, 14 years old, boys catch up and then they continue to grow and they become taller than girls. Um, the secondary sex characteristics are the ones that are non reproductive. So, primary sex characteristics are reproductive organs, secondary sex characteristics are non reproductive traits. So, we're talking body hair, breast development in females, voice changes, and facial hair in males. Now, like I said earlier, puberty is occurring earlier and earlier, and we think this might be because of the consumption of animal hormones. We can the different hormones that animals are fed. They're fed growth hormones, and so people believe that that is going into our bodies and therefore increasing our growth. And this is particularly happening with dairy products and meat because those animals are um, bred and given hormones to grow more quickly. So then we have different stages at which we mature. Boys, we have early maturing boys, and they tend to become physically stronger, they're taller, they're more athletic than their peers. And usually you can tell when this happens, right? There's this kind of like they spark up or they spike up in height and everything. And they are definitely different than the boys who are late maturing, in which that they don't get those growth spurts. They don't end up as tall as soon as the others, and they don't necessarily end up as athletic because they're competing against those who are significantly stronger. I mean, you can kind of see it here in this picture, just the difference in heights in boys that are about the same age. Studies have shown that the boys who are early maturing, they actually tend to be more popular and independent because they are viewed as more attractive, but they're at greater risk for substance abuse and earlier sexual activity. Whereas late maturing boys, they aren't viewed at the time to be as physically attractive and more are perceived as more childish, but they do catch up. Eventually, they do catch up. As for early maturing girls, they actually end up getting a lot of teasing. They get teased because their bodies develop sooner, breasts form sooner, their hips widen sooner, and they actually get sexual harassment more because all of a sudden they're not perceived as a girl anymore, they're perceived as a woman, and there's like a social component to that as well. And these girls are actually more at risk for anxiety and depression and substance abuse as well as eating disorders because they are constantly self-conscious about their appearance based on the bullying and the teasing that may happen. Whereas um, individuals, girls and boys, who develop later might actually be more self-conscious about their lack of physical development, and that's because they are scared that um, they are not like their peers, and so they feel self-conscious about that. So why should you guys understand your own brains? And a lot of it has to do is it will help you as you know as much as we talk about the frontal lobe not being fully formed. Understanding your brains will allow you to make those connections and understand why you're acting a certain way, and in some cases remedy certain behaviors. So as you mature, right, your frontal lobes aren't fully developed, and they're continuously developing until you're about 25 years old. And in this picture right here, this is showing the average brain, so to speak, of a teenager. And right here, the common sense frontal lobe is tiny, whereas the emotions, sleep, and sex glands and sex center and music glands are pretty large. I thought it was kind of funny that they added the smart mouth and the snark gland. Now, our emotional limbic system, which we talked a little bit at last unit, is wired for puberty before the frontal lobe. So this area, your brains, teenager brains, the adolescent brains, is neurologically growing much more quickly and becoming more wired for adulthood, and that's why we have these emotional outbursts and these emotions that we don't know how to navigate and we don't know how to feel is really because that area of our brain is developing at a rate that the rest of our brain hasn't quite caught up with, especially the frontal lobe. And so because of this, um, you might understand that there's a risk or a consequence, but the emotional component of it, right? The emotional component of the thrill or the excitement or just feeling, maybe perceiving it to make you feel happy is more is given more weight because that common sense frontal lobe isn't really functioning. And so, also, what's happening to your brain is that the myelin is growing. Now, if you remember, right, the myelin sheath is the fatty tissue that goes around the axon, right? So it forms around the axon, and it's what helps speed up the transmission from one thing to the other. And what happens is this fatty tissue, this myelin rather, it's growing really, really quickly. And so as it's growing, and we're getting these neural pathways to respond more quickly, um, we're actually having a hard time processing these thoughts and decisions again because that frontal lobe isn't quite there yet. So adolescents really have a hard time with impulse control and judgment and the ability to plan long term. And as we get more myelin and these communications networks are able to join throughout our brain, that is when we start having this improved judgment and impulse control and the ability to turn long term to think about long term and just think about it in terms of how you were as a freshman versus how you are now. Your ability to think about college and what you need to do versus when you're a freshman, that's not nowhere on your radar. So this is just a silly picture of the average teenage brain. I think it's funny too. The love and hate for the parents is about the same. So going back to our neurons and what's going on in the teenage brain, and during puberty, right? So we are now not actually creating um, new connection, but we're creating these new wirings. So these connections are being made through rewiring what we already have. If you remember, right, when we have a young child, we have just a few neurons compared here. If you look at this picture right here, and then when you're about 7, look at all of these new neurons that were created. And what we do by 15 is that we actually make these neuron connections to be more effective. So we are in a sense making new connections, but we're not necessarily making more neurons. It's more along the lines of rewiring and redoing it. And something happens called synaptic pruning. Now remember, synaptic is the connection between neurons, and pruning is a removal. So synaptic pruning is actually the selective removal of unnecessary neurons that and connections to improve brain efficiency. So just like I said, right, we don't make these new connections by having these new neurons. We just take what we have and we make them more efficient by rewiring. And whatever we don't use, we lose. So use it or lose it. That's kind of how it works with your brain. So this is also another thing, and I'm going to show you this about how teenagers perceive the world around them and how they feel when they're surrounded by other people. Oops.
In our teenage years, hormones course around our bodies, causing dramatic physical transformations. But out of sight, our brains are undergoing equally monumental changes. Ones that profoundly affect how we behave and react to the world around us. We all intuit that teenagers have a different view on the world than children or adults. But what's not always obvious is that the way teens see the world is not simply a choice or an attitude. Instead, it's the consequence of a changing brain that's right on schedule. Who they are right now is biological and inevitable. To get a sense of the teen brain at work, we're running an experiment. With the help of my graduate student, Ricky Savjani, we're going to rig up volunteers of different ages to a machine that measures stress levels by gauging changes in their sweat glands. I'm Dr. Eagleman. Then we have them sit in a shop window to be gawked at by passersby. Okay, cue the curtain. First up, an adult. Luisa's stress response seems to be holding about steady at a pretty low level. It's clear that she's responding to people being there, but her stress response is simply not going up. But in the same situation, the teen brain responds very differently. Oh wow, that's a big response. I have to auto scale her heartbeat because it's gone up so much. Her galvanic skin response is really high now. It just keeps going up. It suggests she's stressed out. Hi, Xander. How are you? Good, good. The more that he averts his gaze, the higher his stress response is going. So this is presumably his response is to pretend like he's not there. What words would you use to describe how it felt?
Awkward, weird, pretty much.
It was different.
having people just like stare at you and not knowing what they're thinking.
So why the big difference in response between the adults and the teenagers? The answer involves an area of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex. It becomes active when you think about yourself, especially the emotional significance of a situation to yourself. As one grows from childhood into adolescence, the activity in this area rises, peaking around 15 years old. Now, social situations carry a lot of emotional weight.
So imagine if you were in that situation, and how would you feel? I can actually already predict how some of you would feel a little bit more anxious than anything else. But uh, what they find is right that prefrontal area is is because it's not fully developed and those neurons aren't really fully developed. We're using all of those neurons that we haven't pruned out yet. So what does this mean? So, well, of course, we have terms for it. And one of it is the adolescent egocentrism. And it basically that means that teenagers think that every experience that happens to them is unique. Your parents can't understand. Your friends don't necessarily understand. Nobody really knows what you go through. And a great quote is if you watch any old movie, and even nowadays, right? Mom, you don't know how it is to be in real love. You don't know what it's like to fall in love. And your mom's or dad are sitting there like, well, wait a second. Actually, I kind of do. And what they find is that if you have a list of teenagers or teenagers write a list of, um, I wish my parents could understand when I hang out with a boy, it doesn't mean he's my boyfriend. School is hard and I'm trying my best. I'm a teenager and I don't always have the best attitude. I try to make the best decisions for myself. I'm young and want to have fun. If I'm out all night, it doesn't mean I'm drinking or doing drugs. Now, all of my friends can be a bad influence, and I feel useless whenever they compare me to other people. And so teenagers tend to have this like a feeling that your parents don't understand and they don't or other people don't understand what you're going through. And they also have what's called the personal fable, and it's the idea of um, believing you're unique, and because you're unique, you aren't going to get hurt. And it's that whole kind of, it's not going to happen to me. I'm fine. Like that won't happen to me. He's an idiot, or she's dumb and she shouldn't have done that, or that's just if I did that, I wouldn't have that happen to me. And really, it allows teenagers to kind of do make bad choices and engage in risky behavior because um, they really kind of believe that they're invincible. And it kind of, this constant surge of dopamine that they get is allowing them to really kind of hang on to that and get that high of dopamine pleasure and keep doing whatever you can to keep it going, which is why adolescents are so at risk for becoming substance addicted to substance or substance abuse. Another one is imaginary audience. And this is something that every teenager does. And it's basically where you believe other people are talking about you, or you believe that other people notice certain things that they may not even care about, or everything that you worry about, other people must worry about as well, in terms of being nitpicky. And really, it typically isn't accurate. Part of the problem uh, is we're finding it happens worse is social media. So with social media, right, you post something and you expect a ton of people to like it. Like you are waiting for those likes to come in. And part of that is, right, every single time you got a like, you get a dopamine hit. And so you're these, as teenagers, you guys are kind of dopamine junkies, and everything you do, you want to get that to happen. And you have this imaginary audience that people are going to care as much as you do. Or having this perception that everybody's looking at you or talking about you behind your back, when in actuality you might not be even a part of the conversation. It's just this imaginary audience that you might have. And this is a picture. The reason I put this in there is just, it is not me, for the record. But it's kind of this idea of like, oftentimes we kind of wish that we could hide when we are going through adolescence because we don't want people to know who we are. But we also are worried about people talking about us. So sometimes, like the Blue Man Group, they may stick out, but at the same time, you don't really know who they are. They all look, generally speaking, the same. So let's talk a little bit about how some of our developmental psychologists view things. Now, first we have Piaget, right? And we talk about him as the father of developmental psych, so to speak, because he has all of these different stages that we go through. And according to him, teenagers and adolescents are already in the formal operational stage because they're reasoning, right? They're starting to think about how the real world compares to their ideals. They're able to think about things abstractly and hypothetically think about different choices and consequences. They start to make plans and they start to think about others. Remember, there's this whole stage where there's the egocentrism of not really thinking anybody else is going to um, that anybody else can have a differing opinion as you. And according to Piaget, adolescents are starting to kind of to think about other people's what they're think about what other people are thinking, and trying to figure out. But going back to that egocentrism of adolescence, we still question what other people are thinking about us, right? Because now, of course, we're at the stage where they can't be thinking about anything else. They must be thinking about us, or talking about us. And one of the things is that adolescents, they see justice and fairness in terms of merit and equity, and instead of everybody getting something equally. So remember when we were talking about Piaget, right? We had the little girl who you gave, I took two big crackers and I gave her one cracker of the same size, and she's like, "Oh, that's not fair." But you took that cracker and you broke it into two smaller pieces. She's like, "Okay, well, there's quantity. I got two and you have two," even though it wasn't equitable, right? She didn't get the same amount as I did. Um, she just got the same number. And then remember, equity is not the same as equality. Equity is getting what you need in order to get to the same spot as another person. And because of this, adolescents are starting to really become passionate in political causes and beliefs. And that's why, if you ever look, even back in the 70s when people were protesting the Vietnam War, they were the youth. The youth were protesting. And now we have students who are protesting school violence and against the NRAs, like we had in Parkland a year ago this month. So adolescents are always really thinking about um, the deeper meaning. They begin to start thinking about, is there a God? What's the meaning of life? The purpose has to be more than just to hang out and play, like we do in childhood. Like the whole point of living is to play and hang out with hang out with our buddies or whatever else. Whereas adolescence is, what's the point? What's the point of all of this? But then we take a look and we look at Erickson, right? That was before, right? We were just talking about Piaget, but Erickson said, okay, well, let's think about the psychosocial component. Piaget is cognitive and Erickson is psychosocial. And he says, okay, well, really, adolescents are struggling right now. They're struggling with, every stage of Erickson is dealing with some sort of internal struggle, and they're struggling with their form of identity and their form of the self is, who am I and which version of myself should I be and who is the real me? And I don't know any of this. And so teenagers often um, test out different roles by they dress differently, they talk differently, they change friend groups, they do a bunch of different things because they don't really know, they don't really have a good sense of identity or sense of self, and so they're trying all these different things to kind of say, yeah, that's more like me. That feels good. That I like that one. And that's a really a big part of what adolescence is. And this goes for some things, we can change, right? Can you change your race or ethnicity? No. Can you change your birth order? No. Can you change your family? Unfortunately, some people would like to. We still can't. Can you change your culture? Not really. That's kind of a iffy one, right? You change your culture based on where you live. Are we talking about social culture? Then maybe. But familial culture, then probably not. But then there are other things that we can change, and that's our friends and our food. And um, you do start getting more choices in the education that you're getting. Remember, adolescence goes all the way up until nowadays about 23, 24. And you're choosing your majors, you're choosing what classes you want to take in college to some level. In your senior year, you're even choosing what type of classes you're wanting. You have to take a science, you get to choose which one, and that kind of thing. So we start to create this social identity. And we start to say, well, we are like this. This is the self concept of we. It's my friends and I. My friends and I have this identity group that we go to. And it kind of answers the who am I, right? Because who am I? Well, I'm a part of this group. This is my community. This goes into Maslow's hierarchy of love and belonging. We belong to this group and we identify with those around us. And we kind of start to realize um, we're also really different. How are we different from those around us and how are we the same? And we start to become really hyper aware of these differences and similarities. Um, Now, what happened was a guy named James Marsha. He actually took Erickson's theories, right, his of the psychosocial approach of identity and role confusion, and says actually we can take this a little bit of a step further. So identity doesn't have to be just like who am I? It's identity diffusion, and that's the first stage where we don't actually have an identity crisis. We really don't know who we are. We are willing to kind of float around and test out the waters on a bunch of different things. But by the time we get to the second stage, which is identity foreclosure, and think of it as closure, it's the second stage, we actually start to have, okay, these are my core beliefs. This is my politics. These are my morals. This is my religion. And we begin to adopt the view of our parents or society. And as the older you get, you might actually start to find yourselves veering a little bit farther away from your parents um, in terms of these societal um, community type of perspectives. Then we had what the third stage, right, was the identity moratorium. Moratorium, right? Think of like kind of the struggle. It's the struggle of who am I? Which identity is right for me? I'm taking on this role, these beliefs of my parents, but is that really who I am? Is that really who I want to feel like? Is that really, do I agree with these things? Or maybe not. And so you have this moratorium where you're really struggling with your sense of identity. And then finally, we get to the fourth stage. And that's the stage where I identity achievement. And this achievement um, is when we are like, okay, this is who I am. I believe that I am this type of person. I know what the type of person I want to be. I know that these are the things I need to do in order to be that person. And you kind of commit to this definition you created for yourself on who you are. Um, and sometimes the this can change and sometimes there's a fluctuation and because of that it can cause some conflict later on. It can change your careers, like drastically change your careers. We're not talking like, oh, I went from a teacher to a principal. We're talking like I went from a teacher to a rocket scientist or something like that. You can change political affiliations. You can change there might be divorce later on in life because your identity isn't really solidified when you first got married, but then maybe eventually you're like, yeah, this is not who I am. And this questioning of who you are can continue long into adulthood, and it can ebb and flow as you go through it. Um, and some adolescents actually, what they do is they adopt their parents' belief system, their values, the expectations, and so they kind of say, okay, well, that's who I am. I kind of defined who I am. Whereas other adolescents really are like, I don't really like my parents. I don't want to be like them. I don't relate to them. I don't understand them. So they start to conform with a peer group. They're either a jock or a preppy or a geek or a goth or a misbehavior or a whatever it is. And these obviously are not the only four types of peer groups there are. But you do get kind of classified and you kind of put yourself into a group and you conform. And an interesting thing to note that even the nonconformists conform. They say, "Oh, I don't conform to anything," but then they conform to those who also don't conform, so that all the nonconformists are conformed to each other. So that's kind of like a brain twist right there. And if you think about it, this kind of idea continues of these, holding us into different roles or classifications. Media really plays on. So if you've ever watched The Breakfast Club, we have the bad boy who's the criminal, we have the athlete, we have the smart kid who's the brain, we have the princess who gets whatever she wants, and then we have the basket case who's just kind of a little bit flighty and can't handle anything in her life, um, which totally uh, not always the case that it's female. But if we kind of have society kind of guiding us into that kind of mindset. So also during adolescence is when we start to have these romantic relationships, right? I mean, anytime we watch a teen movie, there's somebody that falls in love and somebody who hooks up, and really our learning how to navigate relationships begin in adolescence, and typically these relationships are short-lived. There's not long-term relationships. Sometimes they end up a couple years. Typically, they're a couple months, maybe a couple weeks, and they use these relationships, romantic ones rather, to kind of identify who you are, and these romantic relationships change how you interact with your family, with your peer groups, and it changes how you handle emotional issues and handle behavior, because again, we become dopamine junkies, and we really kind of feel really good when we're around these new partners, and we want to stay around them. And so you kind of cut yourself off from your family and friends, and that's not healthy. And obviously, there's also the component of dealing with emerging sexuality and understanding, like, okay, well, wait a second, that's a whole different beast that I have to deal with in terms of what do I want to do? What am I okay with? And what is respectful and not? And studies have found that, or developmental experts have agreed rather, that the earlier that you begin dating, the more harmful it can be. And the they find that individuals, who begin to have romantic relationships or dating, um, they really aren't at the maturation level where they should be able to navigate um, the complexities of another person. And this is when you should be going through your own identity. And as this goes on, right, as you get older, you begin to pull away from your parents, regardless of whether or not you're having a romantic relationship. And you really kind of want to start becoming your own adult. And so a lot of teenage rebellion isn't so much as you don't like your parents as much as that you're trying to be your own person, and to some that means being different than your parents. Um, Now, fortunately, most teens do actually think they have a good relationship with their parents, um, and as far as what surveys have shown. However, for a small group of parent and adolescents, the differences between teenagers and their parents can get really, really intense, and that they can create really deep divides between parent and child relationship. Um, Teens start to view their parents as having influence, not necessarily in your peer groups or who you are, but in terms of guiding you through religious faith. You tend to choose the religion that you were brought up in, and also thinking about college and career choices. Your parents influence you more than anybody else in terms of which way you should um, go for your career and college choices. Another thing that adolescents do is, as they pull away from their parents, they become more invested in their friends, and they really kind of become influenced by their friends. Remember, we're always trying to fit in, and we're trying on these new skins, so to speak, so that we can make these new friend groups, or so that we can kind of learn more about ourselves through these new friend groups. And as you do that, you're easily influenced, as everybody's doing it, so I probably should too. And oftentimes that's the argument that teenagers will use against their parents, is like, well, wait a second, but everybody else is doing it, or so and so's mom lets them do it, or so. And you'll probably hear your parents like, I'm not so and so's mom, or I really don't care, because unfortunately for teenagers, or fortunately, your parents have been teenagers at one point and they know what it feels like to be that despite the egocentrism of adolescence. So, um, whatever the teenager uh, is, or whoever the teenager is around, they're more likely to become like them, and hence the term "birds of a feather flock together." And the that's why sometimes parents are like, "Well, so and so is a bad influence because so and so might be a bad influence, but you just don't realize it quite yet." And another problem that we have as teenagers, and that's obviously this is a newish thing, is the larger potential to have a bigger group of friends or knowing more about other people's lives, because you are posting all your things onto Instagram or onto Snapchat or TikTok or Finsta, your Finsta account, whatever it might be. And a lot of what starts to happen is cyberbullying. And cyberbullying isn't only online. It's kind of interesting to kind of make sure you make this uh, understanding of cyberbullying can be, yeah, they talk trash to you online or they share it or they take a picture of you and they post it online. But it also can be when you post something online that they screenshot it and they show other people in person, or they send it through a text, or they talk about it and say, "Did you see so and so's Instagram account?" And I've heard people do that, just talking about what was posted, and they're like, "Oh, so and so is this," and it's really kind of infiltrated and kind of become like a virus, so to speak, as in terms of it just continues to grow in terms of the dysfunction that it causes social media. That's why it's really good to kind of minimize your footprint on social media as you grow up. So here's a really good podcast about kids today. The marshmallow test, which I think we've seen in class, has been updated, and it really kind of looks at how teenagers, particularly, handle things. And it also talks about the mental health crisis that teenagers are going through today because of all the additional stress that they may find due to the use of social media and smartphones and technology. So it's a pretty good podcast. Go ahead and screenshot this when you get a chance, and we'll take a listen to it. So right now is the time for you to have a brain freeze. You go ahead and deep process and make those deep connections. Draw your pictures, create your mnemonics, and answer the questions. Uh, have a good one. I'll see you tomorrow.